Picture this. It is October 1216, and the autumn air around Newark Castle is damp with rot. The stone walls sweat with moisture, torches sputter against the chill, and the corridors echo with the low groans of a man fighting death itself. But this is no nameless soldier gasping in a forgotten fortress. This is John, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou. He carries the titles of half a continent, yet he is dying in filth and isolation, abandoned by nearly everyone who once swore loyalty. He is not meeting his end on a battlefield, sword raised in defiance, like his brother Richard the Lionheart. Nor is he passing in regal peace, surrounded by bishops chanting prayers. He is consumed instead by dysentery, what medieval writers called the bloody flux. The disease ravages him, tearing at his intestines, leaving him doubled over in spasms of pain. Chroniclers, with a satisfaction sharpened by years of resentment, would later describe it as though his insides were bursting outward, a king undone by his own corruption. This is the opening scene of a story that still lingers in English memory as both tragedy and dark comedy. John was so reviled that in over 800 years, no monarch has dared to name their son after him. His death was not mourned as the passing of a ruler, but celebrated as the judgment of heaven itself. And if forgotten, uncomfortable chapters of history fascinate you, stay with us. Because this tale is more than a grotesque death. It is the unmaking of a tyrant, the story of how one man's downfall helped to shape the liberties we now take for granted. To grasp the irony of this ending, you must understand how disease was seen in the 13th century. Illness was not random, it was divine punishment, the physical manifestation of sin. Plagues and fevers were described by priests as scourges sent from God, cleansing the earth of corruption. For a king who had betrayed his nobles, defied the church, and wrung his people dry, no fate could have seemed more fitting. As John cried out in agony, unable to control even his bowels, his enemies believed it was the Almighty himself who had taken vengeance. But dysentery was a very real killer, not just a metaphor. In an age with no understanding of bacteria, the disease swept through armies, monasteries, and towns with equal cruelty. Contaminated wells, rotting food, and the filth of daily life were enough to spread it like wildfire. Even kings were not safe. Picture the conditions of his final campaign. Days of rain, mud-soaked provisions, unwashed hands, exhaustion, and stress. His body was weakened, ripe for infection. The same sickness that slaughtered common foot soldiers now tore apart a monarch. And it was not gentle. Dysentery meant waves of fever, gut-wrenching cramps, and relentless bloody diarrhea. Dehydration set in quickly. The body shriveled, lips cracked, mind clouded with delirium. Each jolt of the litter carrying him across England must have been agony, his courtiers gagging at the stench, their king reduced to helplessness. The chroniclers, who loathed him, painted these details with relish. They saw in every drop of blood and filth the proof of a divine verdict. Think about the symbolism. John had spent his life trying to control everything: land, money, nobles, even the church itself. And yet in the end, he could not even control his own body. His collapse was not glorious, it was humiliating, animalistic, degrading. The chroniclers made certain that his death would be remembered not as noble but as obscene, a cautionary tale of tyranny undone. And yet, there is something more to this picture. It is not only the grotesque spectacle of a king's final days, it is the opening act of one of history's strangest ironies. From this filth would rise a document, a legacy that would echo through centuries. John's life had been filled with greed, paranoia, and cruelty. His death, grotesque though it was, would set the stage for one of the most important shifts in political history. But before we can understand how the fall of John Lackland gave birth to liberty, we must understand how he became the most hated king in Christendom. He was not simply unlucky. From the very beginning, his life was marked by betrayal, resentment, and an unquenchable hunger for power. He was, in many ways, cursed from birth. So let us step backward, away from the fetid chamber of Newark Castle, back into the 12th century, when John was not yet king but a prince already marked by scorn, a boy with no inheritance, a boy who would be mocked forever as Lackland. John was born in 1166, into one of the most formidable dynasties Europe had ever seen. His father, King Henry II, ruled an empire that stretched from the borders of Scotland down to the Pyrenees. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one of the most powerful and brilliant women of the Middle Ages, a queen who had once ruled beside the King of France, then crossed the Channel to marry England's king, bringing with her a dowry of immense lands and wealth. But by the time John arrived, the royal inheritance was already divided. His eldest brother, Henry the young king, had been crowned co-ruler with their father. Richard, the golden-haired warrior destined to be remembered as the Lionheart, inherited Aquitaine. Geoffrey claimed Brittany through marriage. There was nothing left for John. In a moment half in jest but cruel in truth, Henry II nicknamed his youngest son John, sans terre John Lackland. The insult stuck. In a medieval world where land was the currency of power, to be Lackland was to be nothing. Land meant wealth, armies, vassals, and legitimacy. Without it, John grew up restless, insecure, and hungry. Chroniclers often portray him as clever but sly, a boy who relied on cunning rather than courage. And that hunger for power born of being the overlooked child would haunt his entire life. Unlike his brothers, John was not admired. Henry the young king was celebrated for his charm. Richard was a warrior of legendary reputation. Even Geoffrey, less loved, was seen as politically astute. John, by contrast, earned whispers of treachery early on. He was his father's favourite, but also his tool, sent to unsettle his brothers and to break their alliances. In the turbulent family politics of the Plantagenets, betrayal became John's earliest education. This pattern grew darker when Richard left for the Third Crusade in 1190. England needed a caretaker, someone to hold the kingdom until the Crusader king returned. John, now in his 20s, saw an opportunity. Instead of ruling with loyalty, he spread rumours that Richard had died in the East. He began making alliances with Richard's enemies, both at home and abroad. There were even whispers that John attempted to have himself crowned in his brother's absence. Then came Richard's capture on his return journey, taken prisoner in Germany and held for ransom. England was drained to pay the astronomical sum demanded for his release, taxes so heavy they fell on every man, woman, and church. But John? He schemed to keep his brother locked away. Chroniclers write that he actively worked to prevent the ransom from being raised, hoping the emperor's prison would become Richard's tomb. When Richard returned in 1194, the reckoning was swift. John, exposed as a traitor, had to crawl back into submission. His brother forgave him publicly, perhaps for the sake of stability, but no one forgot. The image of John as the faithless brother, the grasping snake, was cemented in the English imagination, and yet fate was mercilessly generous. In 1199, Richard died not in glorious battle but from a crossbow wound while besieging a minor castle in France. The wound itself came from a boy's arrow, a small insult that carried enormous consequence. Richard lingered for days, then succumbed, and suddenly the crown had no heir, but John Lackland. At last, the cursed prince had everything he craved: England's throne, Normandy's ducal title, Aquitaine's legacy. But even on the day of his coronation, suspicion hung in the air. John was not his brother, not his father, not even his less admired siblings. He had no reputation for courage, no victories to his name. To many, it felt as if England had traded a lion for a fox. His coronation was celebrated, but muted. Nobles swore loyalty, but with hesitation. The church blessed him, but watched closely. Chroniclers noted the unease, as though everyone sensed that John was not a king forged for greatness, but a king who had seized greatness by default, and it would not be long before he proved them right. For the first years of his reign, John attempted to assert control over the vast Angevin empire his father had built. But the cracks began to show almost immediately. He was impulsive, suspicious, and easily offended. His reliance on force and intimidation bred resentment rather than loyalty. He alienated powerful allies, neglected careful diplomacy, and provoked enemies stronger than himself. And yet, at the core, it was still the boy called Lackland driving him. Always desperate to prove he deserved the throne, always suspicious that others were laughing behind his back. That paranoia made him lash out, sometimes recklessly, sometimes cruelly. It was not long before England discovered that their new king carried not the steady hand of a ruler, but the restless hunger of a usurper. By 1202, his insecurities had already led to tragedy. He captured his young nephew, Arthur of Brittany, a rival claimant to the throne. Arthur disappeared soon after, most likely murdered under John's orders. Rumours spread that John had killed the boy with his own hands, then cast the body into the Seine. Whether true or not, the suspicion was enough to brand him forever as a kinslayer. It fed the legend of John as a man willing to betray even blood for power. Thus, the boy mocked, as Lackland became the king, mocked as soft-sword. And within 5 short years of wearing the crown, he would lose the heart of his empire. Normandy, the ancestral homeland of the English kings, would slip through his hands, followed by Anjou, Maine and Poitou. The Angevin Empire that had stretched across half of France collapsed in his grasp. This humiliation, one of the greatest in England's medieval history, would define his reign. And it would be the beginning of the spiral, a king desperate to reclaim lost lands, bleeding his people dry with taxes, and turning cruelty into policy. The cursed prince had become a cursed king, and the story of his failures was only just beginning. When John became king in 1199, he inherited more than a crown. He inherited the vast Angevin Empire lands, stretching from the borders of Scotland through England, across the Channel into Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Poitou, and Aquitaine. It was a patchwork so vast that some said the sun never set on Henry II's dominion. To hold it together required more than titles. It required a warrior's strength and a statesman's mind. But John was neither. Where his brother Richard had been a lion on the battlefield, John was mocked as John Softsword. The insult captured not only his military weakness but his lack of honour. In a medieval world where kings were expected to ride at the head of armies, sword raised, John was remembered as cautious, indecisive, and often cowardly. His greatest adversary was Philip II of France, a king as calculating as he was patient. Philip had watched the Angevin Empire with envy for years, waiting for its seams to fray. With Richard gone and John on the throne, the opportunity had come. John's paranoia and rash decisions made him easy to provoke. His diplomacy was clumsy. He insulted allies, alienated vassals, and sowed suspicion where he needed loyalty. The most disastrous blow came in 1202. John's nephew Arthur, Brittany, once his prisoner, had vanished, most believed murdered by the king. Whether John himself wielded the knife or not, the suspicion alone destroyed his legitimacy in France. Many of his nobles defected to Philip, declaring they could not serve a kinslayer. The French king pounced, launching campaigns that pushed deeper into John's continental holdings. By 1204, Normandy, the ancestral homeland of the English kings, was gone. Along with it fell Anjou, Maine, and Poitou. What Henry II had built through decades of war and marriage collapsed in 5 short years under John. Chroniclers wrote with disbelief that the mighty Angevin Empire had crumbled not through overwhelming conquest, but through the weakness of one man. The humiliation was immense. Normandy was not just land, it was the foundation of England's royal identity. The duchy conquered by William the Conqueror in 1066. To lose it was to sever the bloodline from its roots. Nobles who held estates on both sides of the Channel lost everything overnight, forced to choose between loyalty to John or submission to Philip. Many abandoned the English king entirely. But John's failures abroad were only half the story. To finance his desperate campaigns, he turned inward, squeezing England dry. He demanded scutage, a payment in lieu of military service, 11 times in 17 years. By comparison, his 3 predecessors had levied it only 3 times in 60 years. The burden fell heavily on knights and minor lords, who grumbled that their king treated them not as subjects but as coin purses. Inheritance taxes soared. Widows were forced to pay exorbitant sums to remarry. Guardianship of orphans was sold to the highest bidder, leaving children vulnerable to exploitation. John's court became infamous for corruption. Justice was openly bought and sold. Chroniclers noted bitterly that under this king, no man could obtain justice unless he filled the royal coffers with silver, and John did not hesitate to use hostages. He demanded sons and daughters of noble families as surety for their loyalty. For the barons, it was unbearable, not only their lands and wealth at risk, but their children. Fear of rebellion was replaced with fear for one's bloodline. It was said that under John, loyalty was wrung not from duty but from terror. For ordinary people, the effects were everywhere. Farmers saw rents rise as their lords struggled to pay the crown. Merchants were crushed by new tolls and tariffs on trade. Towns groaned under fines invented for imagined crimes. Even the rituals of justice, trial, appeal, judgment were warped into revenue streams. To live under John was to live under constant extraction, where every act of life carried a price. The resentment grew, and yet John pressed harder, blinded by his desperation to regain the empire he had lost. He poured treasure into campaigns that ended in retreat, each failure heavier than the last. Where Richard had been immortalized as a crusading hero, John became the subject of mockery. Soldiers derided him. Nobles despised him. Priests condemned him. But perhaps most dangerous of all was the erosion of legitimacy. Medieval kingship rested on two pillars: the loyalty of the barons and the blessing of God. By 1205, John was losing both. His barons whispered of rebellion, and his arrogance was soon to bring him into open war, not against France this time, but against the very Church of Rome. John's cruelty was not limited to squeezing coin from his people or humiliating his nobles in council chambers. It could be deeply personal, vindictive, and almost theatrical in its brutality. One of the darkest tales whispered about his reign was that of Matilda de Braose, wife of a once loyal baron. When her family fell out of favour, she made the fatal mistake of accusing John of murdering his own nephew, Arthur of Brittany. The king's response was merciless. Matilda and her eldest son were cast into a dungeon in Windsor Castle, left with nothing but a few scraps of food, a sheaf of oats, and a strip of raw bacon. 11 days later, when guards opened the cell, both captives lay dead. Chroniclers recorded in horror that in her final delirium, the mother had gnawed at the cheeks of her dead child. Whether embroidered or true, the story spread like wildfire, cementing John's image as a king who delighted in cruelty, who made death itself a spectacle to terrify others. Stories like this were not anomalies, they became warnings. Under John, nobles were not partners in governance, they were prey. He fined them for invented crimes, seized their estates, extorted their widows, and dangled their children's lives as bargaining chips. Fear was his chosen instrument of power, but fear breeds not loyalty, only resentment. Yet John's arrogance did not stop at earthly lords, it reached higher toward God himself. In 1205, a quarrel broke out that would shake the entire kingdom. The Archbishop of Canterbury had died, and both John and Pope Innocent III demanded control of the appointment. John wanted his candidate, a pliable servant of the crown. Innocent, the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages, insisted on Stephen Langton, a respected scholar and churchman. John refused. He seized church property, confiscated revenues, and drove monks from their abbeys. To the king, it was business as usual: crush opposition, take wealth, assert control. But Innocent's reply was unlike anything England had seen. In 1208, he placed the entire kingdom under interdict. To understand the shock, imagine the rhythms of medieval life suddenly silenced. For ordinary people, faith was not private, it was the heartbeat of existence. Bells marked the hours, Mass sanctified the week, holy days punctuated the year. Under the interdict, church doors were locked. Bells fell silent. No Mass, no weddings, no Christian burials, only baptism for infants and last rites for the dying remained. Villages mourned as their dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. Families lived in fear that their souls were condemned. For 6 years, England endured this spiritual blackout. The silence was more than eerie, it was terrifying. In taverns, people whispered that God had turned his face from England. In markets, rumours spread that the kingdom was cursed. Nobles, whose prestige relied on religious rituals to confirm marriages, inheritances, and oaths, found their world paralysed. For the first time, John's tyranny reached not only their purses but their souls. Then came the ultimate blow. In 1209, Innocent excommunicated John himself. Overnight, the King of England was branded a spiritual outlaw, damned in the eyes of Christendom. Chroniclers seized on the symbolism. A king who had defied his barons now defied heaven. If disease or rebellion destroyed him, people would see it as divine justice. Yet John did not bend easily. For years he defied the Pope, seizing more lands, draining more revenues. But pressure mounted. His barons, already furious over taxes and cruelty, saw the interdict as further proof that their king was cursed. Rebellion lurked in every corner of the realm. Finally, in 1213, John caved. In one of the greatest humiliations of his reign, he surrendered England itself as a papal fief. In exchange for innocence protection, he agreed to pay a tribute of 1,000 marks a year. It was a staggering act. The king, who styled himself ruler by God's grace, had now sold his kingdom to a foreign pope. Many barons saw it as betrayal. Chroniclers called it disgrace. To his subjects, it was yet another reason to despise him. By 1215, the anger that had simmered for years boiled over. The barons were no longer divided by their own rivalries. They were united by a common enemy, their king. In castles and manors across the land, oaths of fealty were broken. Men gathered arms not to defend the crown but to march against it. Even bishops and abbots lent their support, convinced that God's justice demanded resistance. The tyrant who had defied nobles, exploited peasants, and challenged heaven itself was now alone. And soon he would be forced to face his greatest humiliation, not on the battlefield, but on a quiet meadow by the Thames, where the barons would present him with a document that would echo through the centuries. By the spring of 1215, John's tyranny had ripened into open rebellion. The northern barons, pushed beyond endurance, renounced their oaths and rode south, their banners raised not in service to the crown but against it. They seized London, the beating heart of the realm, and forced their king into negotiations. For John, who claimed authority by the grace of God alone, the humiliation was almost unbearable. And so, in June, on a meadow at Runnymede beside the Thames, history was written. Chronicler Roger of Wendover, no friend to the king, recorded with grim delight. Here the tyrant, trembling with fury, was forced to bind himself by the chains of the law, like a common man. On the 15th of June, John sealed a document that would echo across centuries: Magna Carta. At the time, it was no universal declaration of liberty. It was a contract, a list of demands, forced upon a reluctant king by his nobles. Yet hidden within its 63 clauses were seeds that would germinate long after John's bones had turned to dust. It declared that no free man could be imprisoned or stripped of his rights without lawful judgment by his peers. It demanded that justice not be sold or delayed. It limited the king's power to impose taxes without the consent of his council. Even the mundane clauses about weights, measures, and fish traps on the Thames spoke to a desire for order in place of royal whim. The barons celebrated, believing they had tamed the tyrant. But John, seething behind his seal, saw the charter as nothing but humiliation. Chroniclers later imagined him muttering in private, "Why do they not simply kill me, these insolent rustics, rather than shame me with parchment and wax?" Whether he ever uttered those words is uncertain, but the image was too perfect for his enemies to resist. John had no intention of keeping his oath. He turned to Rome, pleading with Pope Innocent III to free him from the shackles of the barons. The Pope, eager to protect his vassal, responded with thunder. He annulled Magna Carta, declaring it illegal, unjust, and forever void. The barons, betrayed yet again, reached for their swords. Civil war erupted, the First Barons' War. England was torn apart as castles changed hands, villages burned, and fields were stained with blood. The rebels, desperate and unwilling to trust John again, took a step almost unthinkable. They offered the English crown to Prince Louis of France, son of King Philip II. Louis crossed the Channel in May 1216, with an army at his back. In London, crowds welcomed him as a liberator. Some accounts even claimed he was proclaimed in street. Paul's Cathedral, though whether any coronation was attempted is doubtful, likely more rumour than fact. Still, the symbolism was shocking. England, conquered in 1066 by William the Norman, now risked falling under direct French rule. For John, the nightmare was complete. He was king in name, but a fugitive in reality, racing from one corner of his kingdom to another. He distrusted even those few who remained loyal. Chroniclers remarked that he often rejected sound advice, convinced his councillors plotted betrayal. In desperation he lashed out, punishing towns suspected of harbouring rebels, torching estates, and seizing hostages. And yet, for all his efforts, his power collapsed like sand between his fingers. Chroniclers relished his suffering. One wrote, "John was the very image of Job, stripped of all wealth, all friends, and finally of God himself." Another sneered that he was more feared than loved, and more despised than feared. Rarely has history been so unanimous in its contempt for a king. By late 1216, John stood cornered. His nobles despised him, The Pope's favour had bought him nothing, and a French prince marched through London. The end would not come in battle, but in humiliation. His fate awaited him not on the field of war but in a tidal estuary, where the sea would rise like a vengeful hand and sweep away the last of his treasures. In October 1216, John made the fateful choice to cross the Wash, a treacherous tidal estuary in East Anglia. The crossing was dangerous, possible only at low tide, and locals knew well how swiftly the sea could return. John, impatient as ever, rode ahead and reached the far side safely. Behind him, his baggage train followed wagons creaking under the weight of treasure, relics, and the crown jewels of England. Then the tide turned. Water surged in, swift and merciless. Horses screamed, men flailed in mud that pulled them down like quicksand, wagons toppled and vanished beneath the waves. Chests of coin, precious relics, golden vessels, even the ancient crown of Alfred the Great all gone. Chroniclers revelled in the story, whether every detail was true or not. To them it was divine theatre, the hoard of a greedy tyrant swallowed by the sea. To this day, the treasure of the Wash has never been found. John pressed on, hollow with rage and despair. At Swineshead Abbey, he indulged recklessly. Some chroniclers claimed he gorged on peaches and cider, others said pears and ale. A few, hostile to his memory, even whispered that monks had poisoned him. But most historians doubt it, seeing only rumour born of hatred. Whatever the truth, his body could not bear the strain. Fever struck, cramps twisted his gut, and the bloody flux returned with fury. Carried in a litter, John jolted along rough roads, every bump a fresh torment. Chroniclers describe him leaving behind a trail of filth, his body betraying him utterly. By the time he reached Newark Castle, on the 16th of October, he was already at death's door. For 2 days he raved in fever and agony. He dictated his will, naming his 9-year-old son Henry as heir. He confessed his sins, though whether from faith or fear we cannot know. Perhaps, in his delirium, he saw again the faces of those he had starved, betrayed and ruined. On the night of the 18th of October, 1216, John Lackland died. Some chroniclers lingered on the grotesque, describing him consumed by filth and torment, as though his poisoned soul had erupted from within. Others offered a simpler verdict, that he died as he had lived, hated, distrusted, and utterly alone. And yet, with his death, England breathed again. The barons, unwilling to depose a child, rallied around Henry III. William Marshal, England's greatest knight, acted as regent. He reissued Magna Carta, this time enforceable, this time permanent. The barons accepted. Louis of France was abandoned, his cause evaporating like mist. In the end, it was not John's strength but his absence that saved his dynasty. The irony is almost cruel. John had spent his reign fighting against Magna Carta, dismissing it as shameful, void, and illegal. Yet it was John's death that enshrined it. The Charter was reissued again and again in the 13th century, each time gaining more permanence, until it stood as a cornerstone of English law. Its clauses, echoed centuries later in the American Declaration of Independence and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, carried a message John himself would have despised, that no ruler stands above the law. And here, perhaps, lies the darkest reflection. Tyrants often fall not with a sword through the heart, but with humiliation, with dignity stripped away, treasure lost, and power reduced to nothing. Sometimes their greatest legacy is not what they build, but what their collapse forces others to create. John's reign is a reminder that corruption, paranoia, and cruelty can consume a kingdom, but even in ruin, justice can rise. Think of the image. Wagons sinking into the Wash, swallowed by a tide no king could command. It is a warning across the centuries. Power can hoard, extort, and brutalize, but the tide always turns. What is thought untouchable can vanish in an instant. The tyrant may laugh today, but history waits with a sharper smile. John Lackland, mocked as soft-sword, cursed as Lackland, died hated and humiliated. And yet, from his ruin came something greater than himself. The idea that no man, not even a king, stands above the law. And if stories like this haunt you as much as they fascinate, stay with us, because history still hides countless tyrants, countless collapses, and countless ironies waiting to be told.